everyone. My name is Nancy Stote. I'm the Media and Program Specialist here at the Framingham Public Library. Welcome to everyone who's here in person and those folks who are watching from home. We're thrilled you're able to join us tonight. And if you know anyone who couldn't attend tonight, or if you'd like to rewatch the program, it will remain on our YouTube channel, Framingham Public Library YouTube channel. We're excited to feature Dr. Vinay Mannam, Associate Professor of Food Science, Department of Chemistry and Food Science at Framingham State University for the lecture this evening. Dr. Mannam's topic is, can the food industry be part of the solution to challenges in food systems? Tonight's lecture is a part of our lifelong learning lecture series in partnership with Framingham State University. A few announcements before I turn the program over. We'd like to ask you to please silence your cell phones. This lecture will be about 40 minutes, and then there'll be a Q&A portion. We have some evaluation forms at the back of the room. If you'd like to let us know, about tonight's program. We'd like to thank our sponsors, the Joseph L. and Roy L. Freund Foundation, courtesy of Elizabeth Fideler, and thank you to the Friends of the Framingham Library. There's one more lecture in this series on Thursday, May 4th. We'll be featuring Dr. Sabina von Mering, Director of the Center for German and European Studies at Brandeis University. She'll be discussing Let's Get Future Fit, Envisioning Metro West Beyond the Climate Emergency. So we hope you can join us for that. And with that, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Mannam. Thank you.
Well, you can tell I'm not a regular at doing this. And thank you so much, Nancy, for that introduction. I wish someone will come and talk like that and give instructions to my students before I speak every day. So I'm thrilled to be here. And when I had this opportunity to speak as part of this series, I was thinking about what I can share. And I had so many topics in mind, and I kind of honed down on this one, the one I'm going to speak today, mainly because I'm generally passionate about food science and topics related to our food systems. We'll talk. I'm going to briefly touch upon what I mean by our food systems. Pretty much means where our food comes from and how it comes, and like what goes on. And then I wanted to engage in the challenges that we currently face in our food systems. And then what the insights I have is how our food gets to our plate every day, and what role the manufacturers and processors and pretty much where the food actually is manufactured or prepared in any number of ways, what role they have to play, or do they have really any say, or like what percentage of the our challenges kind of either come from them, or can they be part of the solution? That was my question. Just a spoiler alert, I don't have an answer. And my hope is to kind of bring us forward with, like, if we really have to solve these complex problems, it's more of a we need it's an ongoing discussion, and they're very complex problems, as you'll see, and just to have a conversation around these topics and kind of see where we can actually, as a consumer, play a role. But before I get started, I always like to address the elephant in the room, or the speaker in the room. The reason I'm here, I am originally from India. I went to a small school in the tiny red dot that you see next to Bay of Bengal. I got my bachelor's in agricultural engineering, which is essentially application of engineering, like chemical, mechanical, and civil, to farming. I got interested in research and science in general. So as anyone who is interested in science and research knows, US is the leader in most of the science, and not as much even more so in farming and agriculture. Like it's majority of the innovations that happen around food systems happen here. So naturally, I was inclined to come to US to do research and work further in terms of. So I went to Tennessee. I stayed there for about 7, 8 years. Got my 2 graduate degrees, one in agricultural engineering and also PhD in food science. So that's essentially how I ended up at Framingham State University. So after that, I was during my training, I was also very much interested in teaching. So this job kind of gives me to do both, to do research and also teach. But that's essentially my training. That's the food science is where one of the things that one another reason I like to speak a little bit about my background because is food science is not a very commonly known subject area. It kind of the way I generally describe it is whatever happens to food from the farm to your table, a food science is probably behind the scenes. So it's all the way from your farm. It's not the growing of the food, but what happens, how it is harvested, how it is stored, how it is packaged, how it is modified if there is a modification required, to all the way to the store. And pretty much the last stage is the store, and essentially all the food companies that manufacture this food will have a food scientist kind of thinking about the science behind what's done to the food. So that's essentially, so that's where my training is. I worked primarily on the processing side. That means what happens to after, like all the way. This is an example of a project that I did in my undergrad. Like what are different ways you can dry chilies and how does that impact its color, taste, and quality. And I did graduate work primarily in that area as well. Like kind of looking at this is a fatty acid from castor oil, and can we use that fats to deliver drugs? So again, this is kind of 2 very diverse projects that I was lucky to be part on. But you can see the scope of, like, you can do as simple things as how to properly store produce, to all the way what are the things that we can do to the ingredients in the food, not just for food, but in this case for drug delivery. So these are more recently, or the majority of the time, what I did is working on grains. The device that you see there is one of my primary research outputs. Like we develop in Tennessee, we developed a device so we can measure weight change of beans or any grains that hydrate. So beans we cook, they take up water, so you can test using this. So if the advantage of this is if you have different varieties, you can see which one takes up more water, which one takes less. If you know that, you can better prepare, like how much time you need to soak those beans or cook those beans. We did this for the same thing for barley, and we were surprised to see when barley germinates, it loses weight. We shouldn't have been surprised, but barley, as it germinates, it starts eating up its own sugars to grow the crop or the sprout. So as it eats up its own sugars, it loses weight. So we could actually accurately predict when the germination starts. And the advantage that is, like if you stop it at the right time without using up a lot of sugars, when the malted barley gets into fermentation for beer, you get a lot more sugar. So that means your quality of your beer will be much better. So again, that's also in the realm of food science. So again, I'm giving you an example of what I worked on uh, before I came to Framingham State. I will briefly touch upon what I'm currently doing as well. But as generally when I say to my friends, I am a food scientist or I do food science, or then they will say, what's your favorite recipe and what give me recipes? Which I would love to, but I'm not a great cook. The difference, again, the differentiation is there is a, if you have a mechanic or an automobile engineer working on the car, is a food scientist working on food. The opposite spectrum is chefs and culinary science, which is essentially your race car drivers who are actually using the food to really do fast and furious things. Right? Really, so the culinary side is the exciting part where you actually create innovative, but which food science also does a little bit, but it's mainly to look, again, thinking about the automobile analogy, it's to actually produce a car that actually serves wide-ranging and diverse functions. Whereas a culinary science, you can create those nice little dishes and kind of come up with tasty ways to present that. So there's a more creativity in the culinary sides, whereas in food science, it's more on the science side. So what I'm currently doing right now is essentially working on what makes a food product stay much more fresh. Like an example of a project we do now is on spinach. Spinach doesn't last very long. It, if you're lucky, it stays about a week in your refrigerator. That too in your refrigerator. But if you, as soon as you open the bag, it starts to decompose. Or so, kind of looking at what makes that spinach go bad quickly. If you can control the temperature and the bag size, and also how it is stored, can we extend it, or can we tell? Let's say if you buy it from the store, the only thing that has any indication how long that spinach bag is on the shelf is the date, best by date or use by date. But you don't know if that's 4 days, 5 days. It's hard to tell. So we are trying to predict how much shelf life a particular food product has or a produce has by conducting experimental studies. So this one we did it on milk. So you can, if you have a container of milk which underwent certain storage conditions, you can test quickly, run through a model that we developed to kind of give us how much more shelf life it has. So we did particularly on the shelf-stable milk that we can get, like you get that you don't have to refrigerate. There's the carton milk, and those last about 12 months. But the same carton that is 1 month old is very different from 12-month old, even though it's still safe to consume until you open with them. But the nutritional aspects, the taste aspect change a little bit over the 12 months lifespan. So what are the things that increase the change is what we study, and that's essentially where my research currently at Framingham State is. So that's a little bit of too much of a big bag. The reason I brought up those examples is to kind of give you an idea what a food scientist does. So as you can see, like there are food scientists who are, let's say, in a company who are thinking about how does this food change on the shelf or in the package until it gets consumed, and how we can minimize the change so that when the consumer gets it, like including the package of spinach, it doesn't change from the farm to your refrigerator or to your table. The actual spinach leaf doesn't change, but what's changing is the conditions in it, where it is. Like it's going from a truck to a store, so the temperature changes. Someone like dropped the box, so it's bumping against things. What impact that introduces? So all those things are like what a food scientist looks in the background and sees, okay, how can we better package so that the impact of a drop is minimized. So that's why you have bags and clamshells, like those plastic boxes are better at reducing that impact. So if you'll see, depending upon how far the spinach has to travel, people like try to different packaging. Again, that there is a food scientist probably behind it, kind of designing those things. So that's the background. So the reason, for now, with that background, so I mainly look at from the what changes with conditions and how can we best protect the nutrition from the time it goes from the farm to your table. So coming to our topic today, what are like my question is, what are the challenges in food systems, and what is the role food industry has in addressing the challenges or kind of mitigating those challenges? So just to start with, again, this is purely, even though it's research based and there's some data backing what I'm going to say, the ideas are fresh out of the oven, or really since last fall is once I thought about this topic. This is like I've been constructing my argument on what are the challenges, what impact it has on our society, and then what our food industry does or what it can do. So as I said, they're really not a big straightforward answer. So, but let me explain the complexity of the problems first. And before we do that, I want to explain the complexity of the food system itself. Like a few hundred years ago, maybe in 16th, 17th century, most of the food that we used to eat used to come maybe within a 50-mile radius, right? And from people who we know, like, generally we used to know the butcher, or we used to know the farmer who is growing the grain or the fruit. Now we rarely know. Really, we could, if we are interested, you can call up the company that made your bread and find out where the wheat came from. They probably will tell you. They probably have the data. But that's not the general, we don't even have a good sense of where all of our food right now comes from. We have like local community gardens, or like a local farmers market, or a crop share, but that's not our primary source of food. Majority of food comes from a complex system of food network, which is connected throughout the world. Now, if you go to a local market basket, you'll see food from pretty much all over the world. Right? And in a way, it's amazing. Like within last 100 years, we could build up a network of supply chain that can bring food from all over the world, and we have access. It's pretty relatively for a relatively inexpensive, or like not very costly to do go out and buy now. So just like in a simplified version, essentially, we have a complex next to us set of players that bring our food. We'll look at that first, but also we have to understand the food we eat is really dependent upon our society where we live in, the politics. All right, an example I give is generally, this is not my favorite example. It's not anyone's favorite example, but we don't eat. For example, there are societies where dog meat is available, but we don't eat dog meat in US. As a society, we don't think that's right? But again, and there are societies where, for example, where I came from India, the cow meat is not generally is not a preferred thing. It's not something that's not part of our culture, and it's if you you don't food has the food we consume kind of has these tiny little things from our culture, from our society, from politics. Even more recently, like what happens in the world impacts the food we eat. Like, for example, like prices are very high now. They have been, and part of it is because we have been in a system of poultry farmers where they have been impacted by bird flu, and that kind of increased the prices of general prices of food have gone up because of the conflict in Ukraine. So all those things really impact our food because of this complex network. So we ended up minimizing the risk, but also at the same time, something that happens across the world can impact what we eat right here. So let's look at really like what I mean by the complex network. So in a simplified version, this is essentially you have a farm. So I generally try to think of an example of an apple. Like we all get apples, but it's generally apples grow here. Apple season is in fall, but we still get apples. Most of the time they are coming from either West Coast or sometimes maybe even from South America. But the apples are picked on a farm. They immediately get processed. They're cleaned. You remove any stems, leaves right on the farm or really close to the farm, and then you package and box immediately, very close by. And it changes a little bit if it's a bread, for example. Like wheat stores well, like grain generally stores well. If all you have to do is let it dry on the crop, and you can store it for a very long time. And then when you're ready, you can mill it and get the flour. But generally, there is a farm where the crop grows, and then there is a processor and manufacturer who does the secondary processing, where it gets into a form where we generally can make a food out of it, right? And that's essentially the manufacturing packaging side where majority of the food scientists are working on. And then there is a complex network of supply chain that there is a wholesaler, distributor who bring that food to your grocery store. Generally, your grocery stores are making that call on what your local community needs. They are saying, they are, generally, we see this during Thanksgiving. They are the ones who are placing the orders for all those turkeys. We don't call the farm and say, I want one turkey, but it's your grocery store expecting people to buy turkeys, and they are placing the order. And it goes to the local distributor. They have the connections with the farms or the processor. So this is essentially a simplified network of, so this transportation and distribution generally, again, depending upon the product, but mostly it's the retail. This majority of our food that we buy comes from a retail store. So it's a grocery store. I say majority is roughly about 60%, 65%. Rest of it is, if you're thinking, it's coming from your restaurant or a food service area. But majority of the food that we consume actually comes from a grocery store. So a grocery store has a bigger role to play. So that's why if you go to Market Basket, the bread there is very different from a Whole Foods or a Stop and Shop, because they are the ones who are interacting with these companies and telling them what type of product they need. So at the end, like essentially, before it comes to your home or a market, food has already been like what we consume has been already decided to a certain extent, right? In a way, there is some feedback. Like if you like a product, you buy more. So the retailers tells the companies to make more. Vice versa, if a product is not successful, they'll say it's not good. So it's a complex network of systems that manufacture food and kind of deliver, and we get. But so at the same time, along with the manufacturers, distributors, and consumers, there are policies that tell us, like for example, what type of like right now, one of the examples we can think about is GMO foods and non-GMO foods. And there are policies around. If you are labeling, like we will see one of the ways all of this is controlled is using a food label. We'll see how that happens. But policies on where to get our, let's say for example, like we have avocados. So there's probably a trade agreement between US and Mexico on how much avocados we can get from Mexico. At the same time, they are buying our corn. So there's always the trade agreement implies like how cheap we can get that avocados from. It depends upon how much corn we are selling them. So that has a big, like those kind of policy and decision makings also have a big impact. The other is essentially based upon there's social organizations essentially who inform the local regulators on where the need is. Like like if most of our school systems have public school systems have some type of nutritional programs, and they tell like, okay, what are the family needs? What are we seeing? One of the recent examples is like if we have a good amount of people coming from, let's say, certain countries, like if there's a migration involved, if the local community sees that, and they inform back to the stores, there are one of the things that happen a lot is when people move, one of the first things they miss is the food. So having access to proper food, like that's the social organizations in the area inform that. There's a big environmental aspect to this because our food uses a lot of resources. So environmental agencies have a lot of say. One of the examples I like to think about is we have a lot of ocean around here, but seafood is not very cheap here. That doesn't really make sense, and part of it has to do with our intention to protect our ocean waters, right? Like if we, one part of it is also if you are fishing in the open waters, it's a little bit expensive. The labor is a little bit expensive here, but the other part of it is to protect the environment. We don't let so the regulatory aspects kind of play into role as well. And finally, probably the most impactful one is the markets themselves. Like market essentially is our consumer demand. What do we want to eat? So this supply chain is not just working on its own. It has, so this is, if to understand what is our food system, we have to not only understand where our food comes from, but also what are the things that are influenced, that are poking the bear. And these are all the different players who are poking the bear. So, so in essence, like, we will come back to this in a minute. The next thing I want to talk about is the size. So we grow about 1 trillion pounds of food in US. Majority of it is a quarter or more than a quarter is exported, but majority of the crops that are grown goes to animal feed. So the food we grows actually, food we eat actually comes from the plants we grow, which is not really surprising, like because farm animals require food and they are coming from a crop as well. So all these numbers are billions of pounds. So animal feed is about 40% of the total grain that we produce goes to animal feed. And another quarter, 250, close to 250 pounds goes to exports. That means we are exporting that corn to Mexico is part of it. We do export a lot of soybean to China. And we also export good amount of animal products. So agricultural exports are one of the largest exports from US. Which is like, we think about the imports we get, like all of the manufacturing sector that is that went out, like during last 3-4 decades. But one of the things that we grew a lot is on the agricultural exports at the same time, which is kind of which we don't really think about, but that actually plays a big role. And one of the things that really surprised. So again, as you can see, the actual edible part of that directly coming from the farm to you is about only 20%. So the exports and imports have a big say on what we are producing, and actually that's essentially how majority of our food prices are kind of fluctuations happen when there is like an imbalance in the trade agreements or the trade policies that are out there. The last but not least is about even though only about 20-25% actually goes direct to food, a good amount of them actually goes to waste. So about 30-40% of the food that ends up in the markets actually gets thrown away, either goes to landfill or doesn't get eaten. So that's another big number. I was looking at the display out there. There are a lot of books in the library which tells you how to, if you have excess, and I took a picture. I should have put it up here, but there's like right in the very prominent area on how to, if you have an excess of, let's say you go to grocery store and there's a big sale on tomatoes, how to prepare, let's say, foods or food products or dishes using this excess produce. If suddenly are too much tomatoes or too much cucumbers, what we can do. So again, there are a number of, again, there's a lot of consumer education that is currently going on, but it's still a very big problem. So that means out of all the food that we are growing, we are throwing away about 30-40%, which is huge. And that number is even higher for produce, for fruits and vegetables. That is close to 60. That means we are throwing away every other apple that we produce, which is, again, there's a little bit of the reason it doesn't seem very high for us is there's about, out of those 60%, some of it is happening on the farm, because again, if you ever went to apple picking, if you see the farm, what happens, like any small blemish or it gets thrown away, that exact same thing happens with the farm picking when they get, so that you can kind of extrapolate the same problem through most of our produce. All right, so again, this is in terms of the volume of what we do. And there are a couple of things I want to, it's also a very big industry. Food industry and food system is a big industry. There are so one is on the value in terms of dollars and how many jobs. So there are about 12 million, $22 million jobs that depend on our food systems. So that majority is, of course, in food service, like in restaurant and retail. But a good amount of them are also in the food supply chain that we see. So So that also plays a big role. Like if you, the reason, whenever, the reason this is important is whenever we again poke the bear, it pokes back at us because it's such a complex and a huge system. It doesn't change overnight. So that's essentially my hope to kind of introducing this idea. And again, this is we saw in pounds, so it's almost a trillion dollar industry. It's one of the biggest industries, the food industry, or like the food systems, like all the way from the farm to your store is a very big industry. Uh, and uh, and it's kind of quite fascinating to see how much we do depend on it, like on a day-to-day, without really thinking much. The reason I say that is one of the things that I ask my students is how often, let's say, on all the things that you spend your money on, one of the smallest things that one of the things that we really don't think too much about is the food. We don't have to worry a lot. Like maybe in New England, we worry a lot about where we can buy in the next, like home buying is a big nightmare here. It's because, again, it's expensive, it takes, which is very reflective in the, so on the left is the graph that shows what an average American family spends on. This is very recent, so it's mainly on housing and transportation. And the third is on food, but it's about only about 10 to 12%. So that's the total amount of money we spend. It's in the same ballpark as our like health insurance and the but the difference is food we need to buy almost every week, whereas a home maybe every decade or so, car maybe again 5 to 6 years, 10 years on average. That's essentially, so food, the problem with food is for us to think about it, it's almost a daily thing we have to do. So when we do something daily, we don't think a lot about it. We got into a routine. So that's another, even though it's a very big industry, there are a lot of complex things, it has a big impact. It doesn't register in our mind very easily. I say us and I'm using it as a general average public. It's hard to think about something that happens every day. It's just same as, like, if it's as simple as if I think tomorrow I have to change my brush or brushing habits, it doesn't happen overnight because I've been doing this for like years. And all of a sudden, if you ask me to brush with my left hand, it becomes very hard. And that's essentially the same with food as well. Food and food-related habits and what happens around food is very hard to change because most of it is really ingrained in our day-to-day habits. I have one more graph to show you, I think, which kind of, this is, I think, a more surprising. Again, this is in trillions of dollars. The proportion of these two graphs that you see doesn't change much. It maybe recently changed. So food away from home is essentially from your restaurants, food services. This is in US is much more common that we don't eat a lot of food at home. Again, this is for an average. You may argue most of the children, like our adults until they're 25, until they start their families, either they are eating in the school or in a college cafeteria. So it's the way we set up our systems kind of makes it easier for us to eat outside rather than make it at home. There a couple of things happening. It takes time to prepare food, so that means if you are time crunched or if you're a family working 40, 50, 60, generally that becomes 70 hours a week, it's very hard to prepare those meals and plan for those meals, go to the grocery store trips. So that's a very long-winded description of our food system and what impacts and what factors influence it. So let me bring up the challenges that we currently face, or the things that generally when we think about our food systems, there are four main things that generally come to mind. One is sustainable agriculture. What I mean by that is like how do we grow the $1.5 trillion valued food products and also almost $1 trillion pounds worth of food that has that at the same time protects the environment, make sure we treat the animals and crops in a way that doesn't harm not only the crops and also the animals, but also the environment that they grow in. Because we use majority of the land that is occupied by humans, which are not a land use primarily goes to farming. So if that doesn't do a good job, it can have a very long lasting impact. So, and also if you don't protect the soil, the environment, that can have a very bad impact as well. So this sustainable agriculture, essentially, that kind of has, like, generally the tone, like, the understanding we get is like local small farmers. It is part of it. It is that, but also at the same time, local small farmers doesn't always mean it's sustainable farming. It doesn't help if a small farmer uses a lot of practices that harm the soil. They also have to kind of buy into that sustainable understanding. So that's essentially one of the main. The reason this is important is majority of the. So one of the things that in New England are generally in that when we are very close to the ocean, we worry about the sea levels rising with global warming, and like I think in again I exactly don't know, but remember the exact time period, but the sea levels rose by about a feet. And it seems to be continue to grow, and as we are very close to the ocean, like we have a very local impact on that. And one of the things that impact this is over across the world, and because global warming is a global problem, what happens everywhere else also impacts us, and what happens here impacts everyone else as well. So about 26% of the global greenhouse gas emissions come from our production of food, distribution, storage, etc. Majorities actually come from the crop production and farming itself. Like we don't really we think about, like, it's coming from. So for example, like one of the main solutions that are offered is like buying local. Buying local only solves that supply chain problem, and only 6% of the total food emissions come from the transportation. So much more than buying local, and buying what we actually eat has a bigger impact. Like for example, animal products have a huge impact on our greenhouse gas emissions. Again, that again translates into, because animal products require crops to grow, so it's almost like twice the resources to grow plant-based, animal-based products. So that's essentially one of the reasons. But the other one, next one, again, kind of continuing the sustainable farming, the other environmental impact mainly comes from the food waste. So I already said, like about 40% of the food we produce goes waste. And that includes essentially the loss. Like there's a, let's say, for example, we make cheese. There is a way runoff that happens with cheese production, because when you curdle the casein proteins, the other part of the milk generally gets to waste stream. So that's essentially a loss. Even though, if you can think, so that there are few companies that actually capture that and extract whey protein and use whey as a ingredient, but it kind of combines both, and this is seems like a very easy problem to solve. Again, it's not, because it happens at like multiple levels. For example, for produce, most of it happens at the consumer level, whereas during the distribution level, and whereas for a finished product, it happens at the consumer level. So it's each of us, instead of like food companies and instead of farmers, it's on each one of us, which then becomes very challenging to solve, because you can't have one policy or one regulation to control. It's more of on a food choice level. So again, these are the kind of at a global level about, and again, it changes from country to country. Here, most of the food waste happens at the consumer level, but in a developing country, or a country that doesn't have enough resources or infrastructure to store food properly, at the production and farm level, there might be more losses. But on average, this is essentially a big impact, not only on the just, you're wasting all the nutrition and valuable food, but also the problem is all this, all this billions of 1.3 billion tons worth of food, where does it grow? It goes into a landfill, and we all know what happens to food when it starts to rot. It produces greenhouse gases. So it's actually not only we are having greenhouse gases during production, but when the food goes to landfill, that itself produces methane and greenhouse gases. So again, it's like a problem uh, for a much more intense problem for multiple reasons. It's not only we used all those resources, but the food. One solution is composting, like we have in few communities here. We can choose to compost our food waste, but that only solves the problem of greenhouse gas emissions after it goes to waste. It's still like we used all these resources to produce, so it's one of the last things we could do, but ideally we would like to. So again, this is another, the other, so again, kind of piggybacking on food waste and we're wasting all the food, is food insecurity. Not having access to, even though food is very inexpensive, there are multiple reasons families in US feel food insecure, either because they're struggling. Generally, poverty is very direct correlation, but sometimes it could be just you don't have proper access to food, you don't have a grocery store nearby. Generally, conflict and climate change can aggravate that across the world. Like if there is flooding, if there is drought, you can have, like if you don't have a food supplies system like a US or an advanced country, it's hard to solve those problems. This is a map that I kind of really surprises me still is if you have a household with children, it's much higher chance that you might be food. So food insecurity doesn't mean that you're going hungry every day. Even if you don't have access to one meal, you don't have the proper nutrition. That impacts your overall lifestyle, that impacts your ability to be successful, that impacts your uh, long-term health. So all those things. So on average, about 1 to 6, one report that in last 7 days they didn't have good access to food. And if it's so, this is not again, this, as I said, it kind of tracks with the poverty levels. The most of the counties that you see here in US kind of go on to the low income uh, counties, but it's not that different in Massachusetts. It's not to say in Massachusetts the problem is not there. It might be comparatively better, but given that we are in a very metro area, generally metro areas, again, cities are, the problem is much more intense because it's not a problem that impacts all of us, but it does impact. So it's about 7.5 so in Middlesex County. This is again the data from Feeding America, which is a group which tracks hunger, along with other USDA and other agencies, federal agencies. So the way our SNAP benefits and nutritional programs work also is somewhat of a problem because it's based upon the income. But as we know, income is not a constant thing. For a few months we might lose a job, but those few months we can still go hungry, but it doesn't register yet into your federal income level. So there's a lot of things that go on, and that essentially cause this few even in a highly developed areas such as Boston, Metro West Boston area, we still see those problems. This is probably one of the closest hitting things with all those challenges is the diet. Because we know food we are all told that food is like drug. Depending upon what you eat, that's essentially how you live and how you can live healthy. Food-related diseases like type 2 diabetes, heart diseases, cardiovascular diseases, essentially is one of the directly linked to the food we have available and what we eat, what we choose to eat. Again, this has to do with not only just your own choices, it has to do with what is available, what is readily available. It also depends upon the society or the social group you are in. All those things impact. And just to kind of give you an idea, one of the few main things that actually have a lot of impact is sodium. we consume a lot of salt in US and US diets, and the same thing goes on with the amount of calories we consume. So those are the three, like again, uh, iron levels, again, depending upon what is your age, nutritional needs, we don't either meet or we over exceed in a lot of cases. So that's essentially one of the, probably each one of us, even though sustainable farming, we don't know. We're not very farming community here, might not impact directly. Food waste, again, one of those things. It's not in front of me, that's not, but health and diets are essentially a direct correlation to, that's probably one thing that we can all connect and have an association with. So this is a graph that I really surprises me. Again, these are all the developed countries, and one of the main causes of deaths in US, and most of these are diets, based upon diets. So that means you are at a high risk of type 2 diabetes, which can cause all other problems. You're at high risk of heart diseases, again, which if it's not maintained is one of the main problems. Again, as you can see, out of all these, high blood pressure you can also associate it with food and diet, but essentially diet related risk essentially are the one of the main problems in, and that's essentially where uh, our food industry, or at least our regulatory agencies like FDA and USDA, play a huge role. They try to address that problem because that they see as a number one challenge. Because again, there are all these other challenges as well in terms of priority, because this is a short timeline on our association with food and diet, and how we, like in the early 20th century, and when we started realizing if you don't eat well, like we won't lead a healthy life. One of the good examples that I think about is 1950s, right around the Second World War ended and everyone came back. We are kind of all like a little bit, but right around this time, oh, yes, there was a small graphic that was missing. But so this is around that time, right before Second World War, right after, is when FDA was formed, Federal Food and Drug Administration, to look at the impact of what we consume, both in the food and the drug aspects, and how it impacts our health. So at the same time, there was a lot of vitamins that are being discovered and their role in our food. Like for example, now we take for granted all the vitamins that we need. Vitamin A and vitamin D are one of the main things that we lack here in New England because of lack of sunlight or lack of proper diet, and they are made available for us as a fortified products in milk products. Generally, milk naturally has vitamin A and D, but once it's packaged, during its shelf life, some of it goes down. Unless you're drinking fresh milk, you won't have all the vitamin A. So because we understand the importance of it, we add some of vitamin A and D. So that's why when you see a gallon milk that says vitamin A and D added, because we recognize the importance. So that's again, all the information for that came right around the Second War, before and after. But the link to diets and health also came around the same time. And actually, one of the examples I like to give is on FDR. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was our, just after he was elected for the third term, he died of a heart attack. But no one figured, like a president with so many physicians around couldn't anticipate that he's probably at risk. Now, if you go to your annual checkup, one of the first things they check is blood pressure, your blood cholesterol levels, to see if you are at a heart health risk. And the reason is, in that span of 1940s to about 1970s, 80s, one of the things that happened, which we are all, as a community, we probably are aware of, is Framingham Heart Study. That's why, Framingham town was called Heart of America, because the study that established that association between diet and heart risk is Framingham Heart Study, and which is still going on. Like they are now modified, like so the association between smoking and risk of health risk, and also eating a lot of saturated fat and what health outcomes it might have. So, so essentially, food and health is where majority of our attention and challenges that we encounter is how can food industry does inform. They do take it again out of all those things challenges that we one of the things that get addressed a lot by food industry is the health outcomes. That's why we see things like this. I don't know how many of you recognize the Cheerios. It says helps lower cholesterol because it has dietary fiber. Because if you have fiber in your diet, it lowers the. It has proven to be like again in a controlled study. That means if you eat fiber and not eat any other saturated fat, it helps lower cholesterol. Food companies. And they also, in terms of sustainability, we started seeing more plant-based food products, right? Like for example, like we have more meat alternatives and dairy alternatives that come from plants. One of the main reasons there is the environmental, like it takes more resources to get animal products, so plant-based is a way to kind of that's another. And again, health and diet is essentially where most of the food industry plays a big role in, or try to. Again, as I said, it impacts everyone, so it's the easiest way to sell you a product if you say it's healthy. Uh, this is palm juice. I don't know how many of you remember this was when they first came out, their claim to fame is they started saying we have a lot of antioxidants in this. So antioxidants are generally health. If it's part of a healthy diet, they could have benefits. But if you're just drinking it from a bottle, it's not proven. So FDA actually asked them to stop doing that. They stopped doing that. That's essentially where our food gets regulated a lot. Not as much as of the drug companies, but we do get regulated a lot. All these federal agencies, including EPA, the Oceanic Agency, which actually have a say on our seafood, and USDA, of course, which has a big say. And they do it mainly by the label of the food. What they say, what the main authority of food, FDA, is essentially whatever you put on the food label should be accurate. And if you don't say, if you mislabel anything or misinform what you have, let's say, for example, I have this example of crab meat, and it is essentially the one way they regulate this is you have to list ingredients. These are all by law, by FDA's law, all food companies have to do this. And that's essentially how they regulate what we eat and how. The nutritional facts label is again as a way to encourage consumers to eat a certain way. Like if we inform them there is cholesterol or saturated fat, we can keep an eye on it. And from all the way to the weight and the font on this label, like it depends upon the size of the label. There is a ratio. We can't, unlike your fine print that you generally see with all other products, on food, you can't really make the font too tiny to read. You have to have it. So that's essentially all regulated by FDA. One of the more recent ones, again, food industry doesn't change. As I said, it's very complex. It has a lot of moving parts. It doesn't change on its own. It mainly changes by regulatory standards. And that's essentially one of the things that is happening right now is there's a new guidance that FDA is proposing that if you, right now, nutrition label is the only way to tell if a food product is healthy or not. But they're hard to read. For an average person, you can't stand there and read at every label to see if it's healthy or not. So food companies have all these other ways, like there's natural, organic, low calories, low fat, but it might have low fat, but it might have a lot of sugars. That's not healthy. It might have low calories, but it might have a lot of sodium. And that's also not healthy. So one of the more recent ones, this is actually currently in the common stage, so it might become a rule very soon. So now food companies can say their product is healthy if they meet certain guidelines. So what it is essentially they, depending upon if they don't have a lot of sugar, a lot of sodium, a lot of fat, depending upon whether they provide whole ingredients. So for example, before, if you consume olive oil or a canola oil, you can't label it healthy because it's full of fat. Now, you can label it healthy. Even before, like because uh, the the definition of healthy before was a little bit of like it's more confusing than it provides a clarity. And also eggs, for example, eggs have cholesterol, so you can't label it healthy. But eggs also provide a good amount of protein, good amount of minerals. So whole eggs were not you were not able to label it healthy. Any whole products, that's something like a, for example, seafood. So the idea is so there is this theory. This is very recent again. Until now, most of the food industry is driven by the consumer demand and also the trade policies, and essentially, it's not centered around solving these challenges. So, but it's moving there. It's slowly moving there. If there is interest in kind of looking at health primarily, uh, there is also push to solve the food waste aspect. There's again, most of it comes from your FDA and USDA, but not from the food companies. And again, the problem there is because it's even though it's a very big uh, industry, they're all small companies. Majority of the food comes from, there are very big food companies, but they only make like, most of them are like either a snack company or a beverage company like Pepsi, Coca-Cola, but they're not our primary source of calories. They are primarily snacks. Most of our nutrition comes from our generally small manufacturers who don't have a lot of R&D or time to invest in creating these healthy products unless there is an industry-wide push, because tomorrow a food company has to come out with a very healthy beverage with low calories, with low sugars, but at the same time tastes good. They have to rely on supply chains that provide those ingredients. And if there is not an industry-wide push, it's hard for one or two players to do that, unless there is sometimes you have grocery stores who do that push, but that implies mostly it's Whole Foods or Trader Joe's. That again goes back to those kind of stores generally end up being very expensive and inaccessible to a lot of folks. So kind of pulling back, there are a lot of things that are going on. Food industry is very complex, if nothing else. Hopefully you kind of take that away. And the problems that revolve around are also complex, but the best way and the most efficient way we have been solving those problems is through regulatory route. Even though, like the healthy definition, a lot of food companies don't really like it because they are taking away. Until then, you would like say low calories and imply something is healthy. Now you can't do that. Or you can say low fat and imply something is even though it is not. So now that's essentially would be my takeaway. So I know I probably went a little bit 10 minutes over than I expected, but hopefully uh, it was informative. And if I would love to hear your opinions. If you, I know it's almost close to 8, but if you have any questions, let me know. Or while you digest this information, again, if you are interested in engaging with these topics, there are a lot of literature in the library related to food, and most of them try to address one of these challenges that we covered today. So thank you so much. If nothing else, hopefully it was informative. And I will be here to hang around and answer any questions. Thank you. Yes. Yeah, yeah. They're very, yes. Yes, it's not, it's very it's a tough problem because the way, again, as I said, we don't spend a lot of time thinking about food. And for us, it's much more easier to just, because it's much more cheaper just to get a new supply chain route to those who need, rather than to divert the food from retail stores and stuff. Because retail stores don't want to give up the food, because just in case, what if a consumer needs that extra bag of bread until it's too late? and then it's too late to donate or divert to someone who is in need. It's getting better. One of the recent things that happened in Massachusetts is if you are a decent mid or large food establishment, either a restaurant or a retail store, you can't send your food waste to landfill. Now you're forcing the companies to think about how to divert it a little bit before it was easy to just dump, right? Like it's better, it's cheaper to just dump rather than divert to someone who is in need. Now Massachusetts, I think it's probably 2 years old, this rule, where you can't dump food product. Like the consumer waste is another thing. At least they're trying to solve at the retail level and the restaurant level. So now we have all these other companies that came out who will take the food, either they do composting or they generate biogas. Like you can, if you if you compost or like if you decompose food in a controlled manner, you can generate methane, and which is again it's a fuel for you can generate energy from it or electricity or like heat from it. So but yeah, it's it's a very hard thing to solve because that requires us to change the way we get our food and consume our food. So that means on the shelf it's less time for the food to stay, and there's a kind of a push and a pull kind of thing. You don't want to go to grocery store and see empty shelves of bread. That causes panic. And food retail stores don't like that, because if you don't see bread every day, you won't go to the store again. And they'll be like, we don't want that to happen. And like, again, we get that anxiety too. Like anytime there is a storm, we see like shelves are like we buy more. Like, we get anxious. I think it's probably one of our like, ancestral brain where that gets triggered whenever like there is a crisis. We go and grab food. So yeah, it is challenging, and it's hard to think how those two kind of correlate. Yeah, yeah. This yes. The question is if you go in Europe, generally you buy from market almost every other day, and does that translate into less waste? They have different the type of waste you see in Europe and here is pretty similar, and both happen primarily at consumer level. So either, and part of it is essentially as a developed countries, where majority of the population is able to afford food, if nothing else, they we don't put the premium on the food waste, uh, but at the same time, it's a little bit better because you are as the challenge with food waste is primarily on the produce side, so it's not processed or prepared food. So the more fresher you're consuming, the higher the chance of waste, because the food doesn't stay a long time in our refrigerator. And like if you have a bag of spinach that you're planning to make a salad, if it starts to turn a little bit, you would rather throw it away and make it instead of making it a smoothie, because you can still make it a smoothie. It won't have the texture, but you can make it. But you have to think in that fashion. But it's hard to think. Something you bought for salad, you don't think, oh, I could make this into a smoothie, or I can freeze it, and maybe later I can make it into a smoothie. But that doesn't really. We don't get into that habits very quickly. And so the short answer is yes. Europe doesn't have it doesn't do any better uh, at food waste than US. All right, thanks for the questions. Thank you so much for entertaining me and being here. Uh,
Yeah, I'd just like to thank you very much. That was a really interesting presentation, and thank you all for coming here in person and at home. And we just remind you we have an evaluation form in the back. And thank you again. Have a
Thank you,
great,
Nancy.
good evening, everyone.
Good evening. Thank you.